This is the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, episode number 15.
Welcome to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show, where you discover tips, tricks, and tools from the leading names in fly fishing today. We'll help you on your fly fishing journey with classic stories covering steelhead fishing, fly tying, and much more.
How's it going, everyone? Thanks for stopping by the Fly Fishing Show. In today's episode, I interview Peter Charles from hookedforlife.ca and a pro with Airflow Sims, Loomis, and other companies. Peter covers tube flies in detail, shows us how to present a fly properly to steelhead, and the unique conditions for picking up chromers on the Grand River in Ontario. He talks about swinging the fly broadside and when to use a downstream men to pick up fish. Peter breaks out some good stuff, including a great story about how he taught his dad to fish, but ended when they got a big eel in the boat and it went berserk. This is a pretty good story, so without further ado, here's Peter Charles from hookedforlife.ca. How's it going, Peter?
Oh, very good, very good. Glad to be talking to you, Dave.
Good. Thanks for coming on. I was trying to think back. It's funny, there's so many people out there as I get into more and more of these shows, as far as steelhead fly fishing specifically. There's a bunch of names out there. I know big names, and some of them I either haven't heard much of or haven't talked to, or all the above. And you're one of those guys that I'm excited to have a conversation here because a lot of this stuff is new to me. So I think we're going to dig into definitely some steelhead fly fishing tips and things like that. So if you're ready to get started,
sure,
great. Sounds good. How about starting us off with your background, kind of how you got into fly fishing and steelhead fishing, and ultimately the place where you are, where you're kind of I'm not sure your exact title with Sims and some of the other companies, but kind of at a higher level in the industry.
Yeah, it started out actually when I was a teenager with a paper route, and I saved up my money and I went to Canadian Tire and bought myself a fly rod and taught myself how to cast it. Not very well, as you can imagine. And my first fish on a fly rod came, it was a level sinking line, believe it or not. I can always remember the fly. It was a black ghost. And I'm out on the St. Lawrence River with my friend in his father's little tin boat. And I hooked about a 1 pound smallmouth bass. And I was on my way from that point on. And of course, I got married, had kids. So fishing goes by the back burner at that stage of the game. And then when we moved out to Southern Ontario in '88, I got back into fly fishing in a big way, and I've been doing it ever since. Cool.
And now you are. What is your title or with like Sims, and what are the companies that you work with now?
It's Loomis and Shimano. I'm field staff with them, and also I'm pro staff with Sims and Airflow Fly Lines and the Canadian Tube Fly Company.
Okay, and we'll get into some more of this stuff. I definitely like to hear more about the tube company and things like that. But what is your generally? What does that mean? Pro staff. What do you do with these companies mostly?
Well, generally it's promotional work, and I do a little bit more than the average guy because I've got the YouTube channel going. Mm-hmm. So I'm able to do product reviews on YouTube and also show people how the stuff can be used to catch fish and improve your game. Mm-hmm. But as field staff and pro staff, you're really expected to be sort of an ambassador for the company and for the sport.
Yeah.
And I attend trade shows. Like tomorrow I'm going to be at the Boat and Fishing Show, the International Center in Toronto, and mm-hmm. I'll be there for 4 days in the Shimano and Loomis booth.
Nice.
So I do that kind of work too.
Gotcha. That sounds great. And the YouTube channel and things like that, we'll dig into more of this as we go, but I'll provide a link to all of the things we talk about today, including the YouTube. This will be episode 15 at wetflyswing.com/Peter Charles. I'll have everything under that URL so people can check it out. That's great. This is definitely showtime for sure. I was chatting with Simon Gawesworth a while back, and we were kind of asking him, I was like, how's the season going? And, are you still as fired up as when you started? How is that? How does it work for you? You go through the show season. Are you at the end pretty tired? Or are you ready to keep going strong with talking to people and answering questions and things?
The show is really your feet. I mean, your feet and your legs are killing you, but you're still got the enthusiasm at the end of the show. You're still talking to people. And in fact, the thing about shows is the more people you engage, the better the show is for you. The whole thing becomes more interesting. If you just stood around the booth and looked at the other exhibitors, it wouldn't be much of a show. So yeah, I enjoy getting in, talking to people, and you're spending 4 days talking about fishing. So, it's quite good.
Yeah.
And then, of course, after the show season is over, I'm getting into teaching. So I spend a lot of time on the river teaching people how to fly fish. And because I'm a casting instructor. So it seems I spend a lot of time either with clients or doing the company work. So my own fishing time becomes a bit precious too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you're, and are you involved in the FFF, that casting instruction?
Yeah, I've got my certification with the FFF. And,
Perfect.
So that's how I got started in the instruction game.
Cool. Good deal. And maybe you can bring us back to, I like to kind of focus on, specific rivers. Do you have a home river, and can you talk a little bit about how you, catch steelhead and get other people into steelhead on that river?
Sure. It's the Grand River in southern Ontario. It runs from the Luther Marshes in north of Toronto, and it runs about 300 kilometers down to Lake Erie. And by the time it gets into the lower stretches, it's quite broad. In Caledonia, which is close to where I live, the river is close to 200 yards wide and quite shallow. So at normal flows, you literally could wade the entire river, in that stretch.
Wow.
So it's an interesting river. It tends to run clear in the north and a little dirtier in the south. So depending on where you're fishing, it feels like you're fishing different rivers. It's higher gradient, clear. The further north you go, the closer you get to the source of the river. In the north, right at the very north, beyond Bellwood Lake, it's all smallmouth bass. And then we have a tailwater brown trout fishery in Fergus and Elora, and below that. And then it gradually changes into warm water fishery with a lot of bass fishing and walleye. And then we get into the area where we have some cold water creeks running into the river, and they become the steelhead nurseries for the river, like Whiteman's Creek and the Nith River and other tributaries. And we have a natural sustaining run of steelhead that make their run starting in late August, and they'll run up the river to these tributaries as the river temperatures start to drop. And so it's an interesting river to fish, and because it's a natural run, there's no stocking. Of course, the runs vary from year to year. Some years you have a great number of fish, and some years it's rather thin. That's just like the normal ebb and flow of things. So it's always challenging to fish for steelhead on that river. You don't have easy days where you just go down, throw your line in the water, and things happen. You've got to go looking for fish, and you got to work to get them.
Gotcha. And are you guys? I've been at a couple shows as well recently, and was talking to a guy that fishes Alaska for steelhead, and we were talking up there. He was talking all about nymphing, because that's pretty much all he does. With all the salmon eggs and things like that, it's hard to swing. But are you pretty much all swinging flies, or is there any nymphing or different techniques?
Well, in the early days of steelhead fishing in southern Ontario, it was all nymphing. I mean, it was believed that steelhead would not move to a fly, that you had to really bang them on the nose with your nymph or your egg yarn fly. And over time, more people started swinging flies. So these days, if you were to go down to Caledonia at the height of the fall season, you would see I would say out of all the fly fishermen there, probably 80%, 90% are swinging flies and not nymphing. So nymphing and this is not an easy river to nymph, because it's broad and flat in so many places that you don't get those easily defined seams which will hold fish, and you can just walk up to them and run a nymph down them. If you watch the guys with center pin work the river, they're working like 100, 150 foot drifts.
Jeez.
In order to try and expose their their beads or their eggs to fish.
Right.
It's not this sort of. There are other rivers in southern Ontario where you can fish nymphs effectively because the run is very self-contained and very easily identifiable. You can walk up and go, oh, there'll be fish in there, and bang your nymph in and catch a fish. The Grand isn't quite that easy. It's more of a swinging river than anything else because it is so broad.
Yeah.
And some places it's quite featureless. You walk up, and if you didn't know the river, you'd look at this, and it's just this broad, bland-looking run, and you'd say to yourself, where in all of that are the fish? And one way to handle it is just to try to swing the whole thing and hope for the best.
Mm-hmm.
The more time you spend on the river, you get to know where they hold.
Yeah.
And so you can concentrate on those spots. But it's not a river that you can easily identify where the fish are going to be, especially in the lower stretch.
Yeah. So you don't have any. Yeah. So you don't have any necessarily buckets within the bigger runs, or it sounds like maybe once you do, you kind of have something like that. Yeah,
but they're not. Usually, those buckets are not that easy to see on the surface. You really find the deeper water by spending your time on the river and banging your fly along the bottom till you find, oh, it's swinging smoothly. It must be deeper in there. Or watching, when you start out, you're watching where the experienced guys are catching fish.
Sure.
But from the surface, you often don't see where they are. And so it becomes a bit of a challenge if you don't know the river to catch fish, because you walk up to it and you say, where do I start?
Right. Huh. Do you see a lot of changes throughout the year during the winter? I guess these are kind of gravel type rivers, with higher waters and things like that.
It's a limestone bottom. So the bottom has a very irregular shape because it's eroded out of the limestone, and it erodes at different rates. So you have these very unusual features where you might have a ridge that runs across the current instead of with the current. You'd expect the river to scour a ridge, straight down the current, but it doesn't. These ridges go in different directions, and they will hold fish in unusual ways. There's a couple of spots where I fish where I've had to design my flies to ride hook points up, because in order to swing a fly through there, you have to be willing to bounce your fly off the rocks, off the ridges, before you can get into the deeper water. And quite often, it's funny, the fish will hit the fly as soon as the fly bangs a rock, skips off the rock, and the fish is on it.
Wow. Well, this is cool. I was actually a friend of mine, Eric, I was chatting with we were at the fly fishing film tour, and I was kind of asking him about questions he had, and he's fairly new to it. And one of them was just that, presenting the fly. That's a big question for him. How do you, how are different ways, to do that? Do you have any, things you would tell somebody new to teach them how to present the fly a little better?
Yes, there's a number of things I put across when I'm teaching people how to fly fish. And the first thing I tell people is that a prey item does not charge a predator. You'll never see a minnow charging straight at the mouth of a bass. Prey items, minnows, will flee a predator. And so when you present a swung fly, you're trying to swing it in such a fashion that it looks weak, it looks like an easy meal, it looks interesting, and you don't want to be swinging it aggressively at the fish, because I've actually done this. I've run these experiments. Whereas if you swing your fly line, your sinking fly line, or your fly at the head of a fish, the fish will flee. It will leave. And so I try to teach people when people are learning how to fly fish, is when you're swinging a fly, make sure it's above their heads, and don't have the fly swinging at them, which means you're going to have to manage the drift so the fly presents more broadside or tail end first to the fish, which is more of how the fish will expect to see a prey item go by. If the fly line or the sinking line goes at the face of the fish, they'll take off. I actually ran an experiment when fishing for Chinook on the Credit River. I was using a full sink shooting head. The water was clear. I could see everything that was going on, and I could see this Chinook holding. And I'd made a few presentations to it. And as you know, with that kind of fishing, sometimes the salmon just aren't interested. They're not going to take. So I thought, okay, let's see what else can go here. And I cast beyond the fish, let my fly line, my sinking shooting head, swing towards the fish, and I just watched the sinking shooting head and that fish move over right to the bank, and my fly line pinned that Chinook to the bank. And when I picked my fly line up, it took off like a bat.
Right.
And it's proof that those fish will not stay put if you swing your fly or your fly line at them. They'll leave. And so that's the first part, is thinking in terms of these fish don't have an ego. They're not going to say, "Oh, you can't bully me. You're just a little fly."
Right.
If it looks unnatural, they leave. They're gone. So you have to present your fly in a way that it's not threatening, and better yet, it looks like it's an easy meal, an easy target.
Yeah.
And the other thing I tell people is try to remove as many things that might cause a fish to reject your fly. So, as an example, if you're running too short a leader, too stiff a leader, these sorts of things, you try to make that fly as appealing as possible and minimize the opportunities for the fish to say no.
Yeah, that's cool. And yeah, this brings up a few questions. Maybe you can clarify just on more of the types of lines and leaders and things like that. If you're using, talking about presenting it, maybe you can go through that real quick. I know, Simon Gawesworth was on episode 9 on the show here, and he was talking about how he likes to use an intermediate line, on the Skagit line, and a lot of people don't do that. Do you have a specific line you like to use for these fish? And also maybe you can talk about the leader and the fly and the whole setup.
I always look at everything as a comprehensive system. I don't sort of look at my fly line independent from the leader and independent from the fly and independent from the presentation. It's all got to work together as one system. So I always start with river conditions, high and dirty, low and clear, warm, cold, what's going on in the river, which means where are the fish, which then says, okay, if the fish are here and it's clear, water's cold, low, how am I going to put those fish, that fly? That's how I make my line choice and my leader choice and my fly choice. Mm-hmm. And even the choice of my cast that I use, and whether I go angling downstream or go more across. All those things are a deliberate set of decisions driven by how I want to present the fly. So as an example, in cold weather, let's say the water is like 1 degree Celsius, 34 Fahrenheit. I won't try to use a sink tip system. I'm going to use a full intermediate, like an intermediate long belly. It's a full intermediate line. It just swings a lot slower and a lot straighter. I think a lot of people don't realize how much bend we get in our sink tip systems.
Yeah.
And so it presents the fly very slowly. It presents in a very straight manner. And I'm using very long leaders on my sinking lines. That full intermediate, I might be as much as 15 foot long.
Oh, wow.
To gain separation between the fly and the line. And my flies are designed with different sink rates in mind and different performance in the water. For example, a lot of people don't pay any attention to what their fly does when it's in the water. They make the assumption that 10 foot of T14 is going to do the job for them. It's going to drag the fly down to where the fish are. And they really don't have to worry about the swim characteristics of the fly. But that's not true. I've actually seen people using T14 and halfway through the swing, their fly is still near the surface of the water. and their system is running in a big U shape or a big bowl shape because the buoyancy and the drag of the fly is keeping it near the surface. So I'm always paying attention to my sink rate of my flies and how they perform in the water. So when I cast out, I know that fly is going to be where I want it to be. It's not guesswork. And so everything is a very, very deliberate choice. So, for example, taking the reverse scenario, it's early in the season. The water's up a bit. It's a little dirty. It's warmer. It's around 15 degrees Celsius, 60 degrees Fahrenheit. And I'm going to use a floating line with maybe nothing more than a fast sink poly leader on the end. And I'm presenting it, maybe 6 inches, 10 inches, foot under the water. That's it. Mm-hmm. And the fish are coming up for it, and they're chasing because it's warm, and they're more aggressive and they're more active. So how I'm using the conditions to dictate what I'm going to do,
right? As
opposed to try to go to the river and say I have a favorite line. I'm only going to use this.
Yeah. Do you have so you use a few different lines? How many different tips do you come to the river with? when you get?
Generally speaking, because of the nature of my river, I can look at the flow rate on the graph before I leave the house, and I know what tip I have to take.
Yeah.
So generally speaking, I don't know if you've seen the Airflow flow tips. If I'm using a Skagit setup, I would use maybe their T7 or their T10 would be most commonly what I'd use in my river.
Okay.
If another thing I use, I still like the old 15-foot factory tips, the old tapered ones.
Mm-hmm.
So typically in those, I'm using an intermediate or a type 3. I don't need, because my flies get down on their own, I don't need that heavy sink tip to drag it down.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. And these, and like I said, I'll provide links to these lines and tips and things you're talking about in the show notes again. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the Canadian tube fly company. We're talking a little bit about flies here, and maybe you could describe what that's all about and how you're connected with it.
Well, I'm on their pro staff, and what I usually do for them is put up basic tube fly videos on YouTube to describe how people can get started in using tube flies. The advantage for me for using a tube fly, and the reason why I like using them, is it gives me choices about what kind of hook I put on the end. So depending on where I'm fishing it and how I'm fishing it, I can make different choices about the hook for the same fly. And I can vary the sink rate for the same pattern, whether I put it on a plastic tube, aluminum tube, a brass tube, or a copper tube. I'm going to get different sink rates out of the same pattern. So it gives me lots of choices. And so with Canadian Tube Fly, they're offering a broad range of tubes, the ones I've just described, and a lot of the materials that they sell are aimed for the tube fly market. So when you're buying off of them, you're buying from a company that's dedicated to making sure that the stuff you're buying is going to work for you as a tube fly. Okay. So yeah, that's cool. And then, do you have any, as far as fly patterns, any, names or flies that we could, take a look at, things that maybe your top few patterns you like to use? Yeah, there have a number of patterns that I use. They're not common patterns. They're my own patterns, but they're on YouTube, so you can actually see them. One of them is called Emerald Shiner, and it's an incredibly sparse fly. It's basically a tube with a body and a wing. There's no and some eyes. That's it. It looks like nothing.
A wing of
bucktail.
Oh, cool.
Okay, just bucktail, a bit of flash, a white body with a bit of a rib.
So this would be more of your warmer water kind of fly sort of thing, and maybe you could explain the fishery there. I'm not totally clear on like the time of year when you're, obviously winter time's cold, but when does it warm up and when are you fishing?
Okay, well, all right, that's a good point, because there's a number of things we have to think about with this river, especially the regulations, the way the seasons run. The fishing for steelhead normally starts late August, early September, depending on the temperatures. And as soon as I say, it gets around 60 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to see fish moving into the system, but some will come in earlier. The fishing usually picks up around October. And through to November, and then it starts to slow down as we hit December. Our December fishing really depends on what kind of winter we have, because we have quite a broad variety of winters in southern Ontario. We've got a bad one this year. We got lots of snow. It's been cold. So basically, we were shut down by the beginning of December. And other years, we've had hardly any snow. It's warmer, and we can fish right up in December 31st when the season closes. And then the season does not reopen on this river until the fourth Saturday in April. Okay. So that whole stretch from December 31st to the fourth Saturday in April is shut down. There are other places to fish for steelhead in Ontario, but on the Grand River, it's done. And of course, once the springtime rolls around, it's typical spring fishing. Water's high. The fish you're going to mix bag of fish that are dropping back and fish that are coming up.
Gotcha. So this harrowing fly you're talking about here, the sparse fly, when would you be using that and in what conditions?
I'm using it throughout the fall, cold water or when it's warm. I just present it differently. In the warmer conditions, I'm presenting it more high in the water column, more broadside to the fish. I'm presenting it faster, and I'm letting it come across the current. And when it's colder, I'm presenting it in a much more slowly and more sort of ass end of the fish, and letting it swing across their face much more slowly. But it's effective no matter what the temperature range is. Just depends on how I want to present it to the fish.
Gotcha. Cool. And then, do you have any other types of flies with different, more of the marabou or intruder types of stuff?
Yeah, I've got one I call the B&C thingy. The name came from a friend. I was out fishing, and I was having one of those days where I couldn't do anything wrong. It was like fish, hit a fish, catch a fish, hook a fish, lose a fish. It was just bang, 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 and that doesn't happen very often on the Grand. And he was watching me do this, and he walked up to me and he said, "What are you using?" And I said, "This thing." And he said, "Well, what is that?" And I said, "I don't know. I haven't given it a name." I said, "It's black and chartreuse." So I don't know. It's a B&C thingy. and so my B&C thingy is a tube fly. It has a marabou hackle and a bucktail wing. And it also has a bit of dyed guinea on the front to help flare that marabou out. And it's proved to be an extremely effective pattern. And it's a sort of you could tie it. It's almost an intruder. It just lacks the rear hackling to make it an intruder. But I've actually tied it with rear hackling in an intruder style as well. Okay. And it works both ways. Another fly that I use in dirty conditions, which has been very effective for me, is a black and purple marabou fly. It's quite large. I called it the Dirty Harry for obvious reasons. And it's also on YouTube as well. It's on my website. And it's been a phenomenally good dirty water fly. It pushes a lot of water, and it comes through the water looking like a big, ugly black leech. And the fish are on it.
Cool.
I've also had success with little flies. Where our fashion these days are to these big intruder styles and large flies, but I've had a lot of success with little tiny things too. Size 6s and size 8s. And it's amazing how small a fly a steelhead will hit. Yeah,
that's for sure. No, that's cool. That's reminded me again, that episode I was chatting with Simon. He was saying, we were talking a little bit about Atlantic salmon. And he said, in his box, he's got size 14s and 16s for Atlantics, which is like, those are big fish. But yeah, for sure, steelhead's the same thing. You can go pretty small. I know definitely 8s and 10s for sure. Maybe you can talk a little more about, you really have a lot of knowledge here as far as the presentation and things like that. When you're, depending on what you do, I know you're presenting the fly differently. How do you mend? Is mending a big part of how you're getting it, or is it more where you're casting?
It's really strictly on the presentation I want to achieve. If I want to, I will actually do things that are counterintuitive. For example, warm water. I have another fly I didn't talk about, the brown trout Weamer, which is my first really successful fly that I designed myself. And it has some, I called it a Weamer because it's half streamer, half wet fly, and you can fish it both ways. And it looks like a little brown trout, baby brown trout, or, any small minnow with a brownish back. And in the early season, when the water's warm and the fish are aggressive, I will cast this 90 degrees to the current, and then I'll make a downstream mend and put a big belly in my floating line. And what that does is it causes the fly to run downstream, then it turns the corner across stream, then it turns the corner again to come upstream. And I've often found the fish were hitting it as it turned the corner. And so you can imagine if you're a steelhead sitting in a run, and this fly is going along, and it's a good 1.5 feet, 2 feet over your head, and it's coming towards you, and then it turns and goes sideways. Yeah. And to the fish, it looks like, that guy's trying to get away. Yeah. And they whack it. I've as I said, this fishery is not an easy fishery where you're going to get 20 fish in a day. Mm-hmm. One is a good day. Yep. And I've hooked 7 on that fish in the same run, on that fly in the same run.
Yeah, that's a really good day.
Yeah, for this river, it's a fantastic day.
Yeah, that's cool.
So when we're talking about mending, it's all about what I want to have that fly do. So, for example, if I want to sink the fly, as soon as I cast out, I'm casting out, say, 45 degrees downstream. As soon as that fly is hitting the water, the line is hitting water, I'm already making an upstream mend. So I'm reorienting the line as close to parallel to the current as I can possibly get it. Mm-hmm. My rod tip is high and back, And then as my lines begins to swing, I'm dropping my rod tip. So it's slowing the swing down. It's sinking the fly. It's keeping the line straight as straight as possible. And I do this a lot with intermediate lines. And so what you have is this presentation to the fish where the fly is dropping back towards the fish. And that's an important thing from a predator standpoint, because a minnow that's dropping back in the current is a minnow that is weak and is having trouble keeping its position. Yep. So that dropping back attitude of the fly is enticing towards the fish. And it's also getting the fly down to them without me having to add a lot of weight to the fly or use a heavy tip or anything like that. It's sinking the fly on its own, which is one of the reasons why I can get away with very long leaders, 10-foot, 15-foot leaders, is that dropping down action is sinking the fly down to the fish.
Gotcha. And as well as the flies, are you using beads and different, or how are you weighting your flies to get them down? Do you use a lot of weight?
Generally, no, but I do use weighted flies. I don't have any hang up about using weighted flies. It's just that I don't really need to use them that much on my river. Mm-hmm. I look more at the properties of the fly. I have an unweighted series of flies I call downforce flies. They don't have any gimmicks on them or any weight. They just rely on a heavy hook and proper angling of the wing and keeping them sparse. And to give you a little indication of how effective they are, I was out with a friend fishing this one run. He was using a standard steelhead fly with a 15-foot Type 3 leader, a sink tip, and a short leader. And I was using a floater with about 18 foot of fluorocarbon for a leader and one of my downforce flies, and I was hanging up on bottom more than he was.
Wow.
So if the fly is designed correctly, it will get down fast and it will stay down. These things don't really plane down, like they don't dive like a Rapala would dive. But if they get down, if you allow them to sink, the pressure on them, the water pressure on them is enough to keep them down. And if you couple that with a long, thin fluorocarbon leader, the pressure on the leader is not sufficient to pull them up.
Yeah.
So, it's basically you're casting them out, you're letting them sink, and then you're letting them swing, and they'll stay down. So by manipulating the fly design, I'm able to get my flies down fast and keep them down without adding weight, which means they're more lively on the end of the leader.
Yeah.
They don't come through like a rock.
Exactly.
They move in the current. But if I have to, I've got other flies that I use for fishing Lake Erie for smallmouth bass, and they weigh a ton. And they're designed to get down 15, 20, 25 feet in Lake Erie. So I'm not beyond using weight. I just use it where I need to.
Yep. Huh.
So my steelhead flies, to make it a short answer, my steelhead flies are unweighted.
Gotcha. So, I'm always, I got a question for you come up here. I'm always thinking about, if somebody's new and is in your area and they're getting on the Grand River, and kind of bring you back to, where you start, like how you're looking at a run, where do you start to fish? Mm-hmm. It sounds like it's challenging for your rivers. But before we get there, I wanted to talk a little bit about maybe a turning point in your life or career, something that, you're a big name in fly fishing, and you're working for a lot of these big companies. As far as you're there now, but do you have a point in your life that was kind of maybe a big struggle, or something that kind of was the big change and got you to where you are?
Yeah, I probably time out in the river with my dad, and what that did for me, basically, it made me a self-reliant type of fisherman who taught himself and went out and did things, figured things out for himself. And the reason for this is my dad grew up in London, England, and never ever had a fishing rod in his hands. And so when we came over to Canada, he had no exposure to fishing, and it was my neighbors that took me fishing. And one day, I guess I was about 10 years old, I decided about time I taught my dad how to fish, which is kind of back to front. Your father's supposed to be teaching you how to fish. And yeah. My dad rented this little tin boat. We went out to St. Lawrence River to catch perch, and he hooked something big, and he's hauling it in, and he's very excited. This is his first real significant fish in his entire life. And he gets it near the boat, and I look over, and it's a huge eel.
Wow.
No, I don't want that thing in the boat. I mean, if you've ever hooked a big eel and you pull it in a boat, it's a nightmare.
Oh, really?
It squirms everywhere. It's thrashing like mad, and it's as slime as anything you can imagine.
And how long is this fit?
This thing's probably 3 feet long.
Oh, wow.
And probably 1.5 inches in diameter. And I said, leave it in the water, Dad. I'll unhook it. And he was just too excited. He just yanked it out of the water and dumped it in the middle of the boat. And it just thrashed everywhere. And it knotted up its line full of slime. And that was kind of like the last time I ever took my dad fishing. So I don't think he ever wanted to go fishing after that experience. I mean, the boat stunk afterwards because in the hot sun, all that eel goo was cooking and all our stuff was slimed. So it turned him off of fishing. So it meant from that point on, if I was to learn anything, I would have to be self-taught.
That's cool.
There was nobody out there who was going to hold my hand. And so it's meant that when I started getting into steelheading, I took a very analytical approach, and I went out and found out things for myself. Of course, I relied on advice from other people, but I didn't just say, okay, fine, that person said I should fish this way. I'd go check it out, and I'd sort of say, okay, why is it working or why is it not working? And I would always be asking these questions. And I think it comes from the fact that as a kid, I had to figure this all out for myself.
Yep. That's such a great point. And I think of my own story, which is a little bit the opposite of that. And I totally agree with you. I basically had a dad that was fully in it, guided, fly fishing, everything. And because he was there, it's like I learned everything from him and didn't really go outside of that. And to the detriment a little bit, because he was kind of a little bit anti-spay, he just kind of had fished, since the beginning and never really got into it. So I kind of took that up and never got into spay casting until a lot later. And actually, I think that's a good thing now because it gives me a good perspective. But at the time it kind of held me up. So I hear that. It's great. Basically, not having your dad forced you to go out and just like a lot of us should do, just learn on your own and life experiences and all that.
I mean, I did rely on advice from other people, obviously.
Sure.
And but the thing is, I always tested that advice. The thing is, when you're being taught by a parent or somebody you highly respect, you tend not to test what they tell you, and which is perfectly understandable. I wouldn't either under those circumstances. But the fact that I was taking advice from people who, I just knew them, they were there, and they would say, "Oh, we should do this." Well, I would go try it, but I would always take a testing attitude towards it and not just simply assume it's going to work automatically.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's pretty much for me. Eventually, I was heading up to my first trip up to BC, and I knew that, a two-handed rod was going to be helpful. So I picked it up then, and it was well worth the effort because it got me into a lot more fish. But no, this is good. I think we're going to probably eventually run out of time here because I've got so many. You're doing a great job, explaining this stuff, and I think it's definitely good. Your perspective on things. Maybe you could chat a little bit about. We're talking about people that influenced you. Do you have a few, a mentor or two, a few people over your life that helped you get to where you're at?
Yeah, one was kind of ironic. And when I first got to Southern Ontario, I wanted to get back into fly fishing. And, but I didn't know the area, and I didn't know what opportunities there were. And I had a lot of, camera gear because I was a ex-semi-pro, photographer. So I want to get rid of this camera gear. I put an ad in the newspaper, and the guy who, answered the ad to pick up my, camera gear was a former guide from the Bow River in Calgary. So, he ended up swapping fly gear for camera gear, and then he started taking me on the river.
Cool.
And so he introduced me to trout. And that, by extension, turned me into a steelhead fisherman. Because up to that point, my focus had been entirely warm water fishing. Okay. There was no trout opportunities where I used to live. And so that was the thing. I mean, I started to learn how to nymph, for example. I learned how to present a dry fly. Up to that point, I'd been 100% streamer fisherman. Casting for smallmouth bass. So he did introduce me to these things, and then I took it from there.
And what is he around, or is he? I'm not sure if you mentioned his name there.
I've lost track of him now. I mean,
Okay.
this is years ago.
Back in the day, sure.
Yeah. You know how it is with work and everything else and families. You're all going in different directions and doing different things.
Yeah.
So I've kind of lost track of Mike. This goes back about 20-something years.
Gotcha.
So
that's cool.
Actually, it's longer than that, 25 years roughly, even longer. So, I mean, we haven't seen each other in a dog's age, but he did get me started. He was provided the gear. He got me started also in rod building, and he got me started in fly tying as well. Mm-hmm. He gave me a whole bunch of his surplus fly tying stuff to get started. And, you know, he also showed me how to build a rod, and I went from there.
Oh, cool. Yeah, I'm always trying to, that's part of this is just connect the dots. And that's why I love talking to new people that I haven't, you know, talked to before, because, you know, I hear other people, and then, you know, you'll be connected to somebody else that that's part of what I'm doing here with the show is just, you know, providing that history for folks. But yeah, let me bring it back to that question I mentioned before. So you're new to a river, and you know, how do you get started? I mean, the Grand sounds like a very challenging river if you've never fished before to know where to start. And you said maybe just cover the whole river. Is that, do you think, the best way when you're new, or do you have any tips for people that are?
No. For me, it's all about observation. Walk up to, first off, ask questions, you know, get as much information as you can before you show up. But when you get, I think there's a tendency for us, and we all do it. I mean, I do it too. You get excited, you're in a new spot, you get excited, you gear up, you run down to the river and you start fishing. Whereas really it's just sit back and take a look and think to yourself, okay, I'm looking at this current. This current's moving through there. What does that suggest? Well, it suggests maybe it's a bit deeper there. So maybe I should start there. And, you know, where are the fish likely to hold? You know, ask yourself these questions. Where, if I was a steelhead, where would I be?
Right.
You know, where would I be going up? And sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. But some things I tell people when I'm teaching them to fish is look for bookends. And what I mean by that is an obstacle at the beginning of a run and an obstacle at the end of the run with some slower, deeper water in between. If you can find a run that's bookended by obstacles, shallow riffles, you're likely to find fish in the middle. Mm-hmm. And you can use the Atlantic salmon approach, where, you know, in the evening they're likely to be at one end of the pool, and in the morning they're likely to be at the other end. You can take those kinds of approaches, but basically I'm saying look for these structures. They're going to cause a fish to stop and hold. And as I say, and in our river, you're looking for depth. And looking for those bookends are usually going to get you into fish. Mm-hmm. And quite often, the fish will get over the obstacle. They'll hold in the first deep, slow water they can find, and that's where to start fishing.
Mm-hmm. Perfect.
And so, I mean, that's probably the simplest tip, because people can see the bookends.
Yeah,
you know, they can see those riffles that act as obstacles for the fish, especially when the water is lower. Mm-hmm. It's tougher when the water is up. The river tends to go very bland. When the water goes high, it looks featureless. But as it goes down, you begin to see those features. Okay. And you'll be able to fish them more effectively. And
do you find that, sounds like I mean, when you get to these runs, you guys have pretty large, long runs on the Grand. Do you find that I know Jack Mitchell, who I talked to on, you know, episode 2, mentioned kind of the heads and tails, really focusing on, you know, those, the bookends or the heads and tails. Do you typically do that, or are you fishing the whole run all the way through the guts and everything?
Because it's that limestone bottom that erodes in an irregular way, you often find that you have to go through the whole run, because there could be a dent in the middle where the fish are sitting. Mm-hmm. And so if it was a straight gravel bottom, yeah, you would say they could be at the tail or the head. But because of this irregular bottom, you sometimes find them in unusual places. Mm-hmm. And so it means if you're not sure where those spots are, you should go the whole run.
Gotcha.
And the other thing that I run into with our river is when the flows are running around average rates, there's some parts of the river that are quite slow moving, and the fish treat it almost like it's a lake, and they kind of move around. And so they're not stuck in that one spot as they would be if the flow rate was higher. They're quite happy to move around. So sometimes you can say they're going to be in this spot, but other times you're going to catch them in some place that you've never hooked a fish before. And you say to yourself, okay, why was that fish there? And well, it's the flow rate. It was comfortable moving around.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I say, I do suggest to people, if they don't know the fish holding spots, work the whole run.
Yeah. Yeah. Just cover until you get into a touch or a grab or some
right.
Positive reinforcement.
That's right. That's right. And then make note of it, because it's if the fish are there today, there's likely going to be a fish there tomorrow.
Nice.
One of the other pieces of advice, and I got this from another guy and it made perfect sense. I fish this river for smallmouth bass in the summer, and his comment was, and it's quite true, if you find a spot that holds bass in the summer, it'll probably hold steelhead in the winter. And because they tend to like the same kinds of things. Not totally the same, but keep in mind, when we're talking about steelhead, they're migrating as opposed to feeding. We're not talking about resident trout feeding. So they're looking for a route. They're looking for a highway up the river. And that highway normally takes them through some of the prime smallmouth water. And the type of structure that smallmouth like also provides shelter for steelhead.
Yeah.
Yeah,
go ahead.
So if you catch a bass in a spot and you're catching lots of bass in a spot, make note of it, because you'll probably find a steelhead there in the fall.
That's a cool tip. Yeah. So what's your favorite? Do you have a favorite bass fly you like to use?
I have a whole bunch of bass flies, but I generally lately I've been using a lot of rabbit strip wing bass flies. They proved to be quite successful for me. But my fly habits tend to change from year to year, because I'm always trying stuff. I've got one thing I do, which is I don't recommend to people, but when I find something is really working and it's worked well for me, I stop using it. I want to go on to something else. I want to try something else.
Yeah.
So like my brown trout Weamer, incredibly effective pattern for both bass and steelhead. I've caught 15 different species on that fly, including saltwater.
Jeez.
And I hardly use it because I know I'm going to throw it in the water. I'm going to catch something. So let me try something else.
Nice. Cool. I'll definitely make note of that one here in the show notes. I'll try to find I guess a lot of these you have videos, you said, on YouTube.
Yes, that's correct. Yes.
Perfect. You've talked a lot about definitely some tips and things here. Do you have a specific, maybe I guess we get a little bit into either spay casting or just a general steelhead tip that could help somebody, whether they're on the Grand or any other steelhead river?
Yes, if you're going to, especially on a big river like the Grand, we talk about the fact that you don't catch fish by casting, you catch fish by presentation. But the reality is, when you're dealing with a big river and big runs and you have to cover water, put the effort into learning to cast well, be able to cover that water. If you can only cast 60 feet and the run is 100 feet wide and you can only cast 60, well, you're only covering 60. There's another 40 that you're not touching. And not only that, but it's more enjoyable. You're not being frustrated. You're spending more time with your fly in the water and you're less time fiddling and messing around with things. You see guys who don't cast well, and they're fighting their cast, and they're making the same cast 2 or 3 times to get the fly line out there. So spend some time learning to cast well. You don't have to be a championship caster, but if you can cast reasonably well, you will catch more fish. And the thing is, the other aspect to that is you should be out there concentrating on your presentation. Your casting should be, just a means to an end. So you shouldn't be concentrating on your casting. You should be concentrating on your presentation. If you're having struggles with your casting, you're not thinking about your presentation. And so that effort in improving your spay casting is definitely going to help you to catch more fish. You'll cover more water and you'll cover it more effectively because you're now concentrating on your fishing and not your casting.
Yeah. And is the best way to get there is just to get out and cast, or do you have any tips on helping people?
Well, I'm a certified casting instructor. So the answer is get casting lessons.
There you go.
It helps.
Yeah.
It helps. And the other thing which goes along with this, and this kind of, it's going to sound funny coming from a guy in the industry, but you'll save money, because I see too many people buying lines instead of getting casting instruction or changing their rods. Oh, it's a crappy rod. I'm going to get a different rod. No, there's nothing wrong with your rod.
No.
There's nothing wrong with your line.
Yeah.
So they're buying tackle to solve casting problems. And of course, that's good for the tackle companies. But the reality is you'll stay in it longer. And it's long term, it's better for the tackle companies because you will fish more. You will be more successful. You'll be out in the water more. Mm-hmm. You'll fish longer. So, a couple of $100 spent on casting lessons will probably save you a lot of money in tackle down the road.
Yeah.
And you'll be a more effective fisherman.
Where's a good way as the Federation of Fly Fishers? Is that a good place if you don't know any casting instructors in your area? Yeah.
Yeah. They have a list of all the instructors you can put in your province and that, or your state.
Yep.
And it'll tell you where all the casting instructors are for your area.
Yeah.
So the FFF site is a good way to start.
Cool. Yeah. I was having a conversation with Brian Chow, and he brought up just that point we're talking about. I mean, there's so much information online. It's almost it's overload, right? It's just there's people out there and they're just reading, and what they need to do is get on the water and probably practice and also get a lesson. And so
that's right.
Yeah, it's kind of backwards the way the internet, and hopefully
I was going to say the other thing is, let's say, for example, you're a single-handed trout guy and you want to get your first spey rod, learn to spey cast and get out there and swing for steelhead. A lot of guys make the mistake of buying their gear first and then figuring out how they're going to learn how to cast it. They should, in reality, take some lessons first before they spend a nickel on tackle.
Yeah.
And you can learn to spey cast on a single-handed rod. And a good instructor will have gear that they can lend you to learn on. You will have a much better idea of what what works for you if you've already had the opportunity to learn. Yeah. Then when you go to the store, you're going to make a more intelligent buying decision, as opposed to just buying what somebody else suggests, and then you find out it's not working for you because it's not good for your river.
Sure.
Or it's not the kind of fishing you like to do. One of the things I talk to guys who are trout fishermen, I'd say, are you a dry fly fisherman? Are you a nymphing guy? What's your preference? And if a guy is a really diehard purist dry fly guy, I am not going to start him off with a heavy Skagit rig with the big weighted flies. Mm-hmm. Just not going to, psychologically, it's not going to work for the guy. He's chucking all this weight. I'll set him off on a finesse rig because it's going to be more in tune with his trout fishing,
mm-hmm.
And so those kinds of things, try to find out where the guy sets. As an instructor, I try to figure out, where's he coming from? What's he like to do? And then, I pull out the equipment that I think is going to match that for him. And we'll start him off with that. And then, he's got a better basis for making a buying decision down the road.
Yeah. Yeah. What, as far I got a few more questions here, Peter. I think we're going to be wrapping this up here in a bit, but I want to touch base with you on a couple things. One of them, just again getting back to the river, as far as stepping down. This is a question that comes up quite a bit. Do you have a recommendation, like how fast you move through a run?
Yeah, so it all depends on clarity, and current speed. If you've got a lot of clarity, you can step down quite aggressively because the fish can see the fly from quite a distance. If the river is dirty, and especially if it's fast moving, because your fly could be coming across faster than you would like, take your time, make smaller steps. Be prepared to cast to the same area a couple of times if you think there might be a fish there, because in dirty, faster conditions, the fly may come across, you may not see it the first time. So be more deliberate in dirty conditions. And if you have had a touch, don't go back and bash to the same spot right away. Back up, go back a few feet, take a minute to rest, come back down again, and you'll have a better shot at that fish.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And do you do any use any skaters or anything over there?
I don't use skaters myself, but we've got a local fellow who is a biologist who used to work with the government, and he is a phenomenal fisherman, and a guy by the name of Larry Halyk, and he loves skating flies for steelhead, and he does extremely well. So it's definitely a method, but you have to know what you're doing. You have to know where you're fishing, and Larry does, so he's quite successful.
Nice.
But I'm I've always been more of a streamer fisherman, so I take a more of a streamer approach for steelhead. I am thinking always in terms of minnow patterns, and so that's usually my approach.
Yeah, that's good. What I had a note here about your Guideline days. I'm not even sure what that's about. Is that Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Was that earlier on?
Yeah, that was a little over 10 years ago. I got in with Guideline, which is a Scandinavian company. And that was my first pro staff experience. And so I put my effort into learning the Scandinavian methods for catching fish, and the tackle and the gear and that sort of thing. And so that was my pro staff start.
Gotcha. And how are those Scandinavian methods different from what you're doing now?
Really not that much different. I mean, I use all methods, all line types, and I generally go Scandinavian style. Often just I'm looking at river conditions, and if I figure that faster, higher presentation, or if the river's lower, or the type of fly I'm using doesn't require it gets down on its own, I don't have to worry about getting it down, I might go with Scandinavian. A lot of it, believe it or not, is being driven by the amount of drag in the fly. High drag flies don't extract from the water easily. And so when you're using a Scandinavian system, sometimes it's a little hard to get them out of the water, or it forces me to use a shorter leader than I would like. That's when I might shift over to Skagit. But, if I'm using a fly that extracts easily, then there's no reason why I can't use a 15 or 20 foot leader instead of a sink tip and get it down to the same depth. Mm-hmm. Cool. So yeah, I'm kind of eclectic when it comes to that. I go with the conditions and what I feel like doing that day. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's good. But do you have love the fishing story? I know you've told some good stories here. Do you have one that either a kind of a old crazy fishing story or a memorable fish you want to talk about?
Yeah. I have a memorable fish, and it was a 10-inch long rainbow trout, baby steelhead. And it was not that it was a great fish or anything of that nature. It was because it was in an impossible position. It was in a little back eddy, underneath some foam, underneath an overhanging cedar tree that was guarded by a very fast chute that shot down in front of the back eddy. And I sat there and for about 10 minutes going, there's got to be a fish in there. How do I get a dry fly in there and have it stay there long enough for a fish to hit it? And I figured out that what I have to do with an aerial mend and how I'd have to sidearm it in there. And the fly landed about 2 inches from the foam, and it was there for about 3 seconds before it was yanked out by the fast chute. And that was long enough. He took it. And it was like to sit there and plot it out and then make that, you got one cast.
Yeah.
And to make it happen, it was like, as I was saying, it was only about a 10-inch fish.
Yeah.
But it was to conquer the circumstance, which made it fun.
Yeah. That's good.
I tend to remember those more than I remember the big ones.
Yeah.
If the big one came in a relatively easy fashion, I did nothing special to get it, I tend to forget about it. Mm-hmm. But if there was some challenge to it, if I had to, figure it out, do something unusual, those are the ones I remember.
Yeah, that's a great story. I think people tend to get a little too caught up on fish size and fish numbers, and really when it comes down to it, it's like more of the experiences, and that one right there is pretty. As you were saying it, I was just picturing, myself in that same situation and knowing how challenging that is. That's pretty cool. Cool, Peter. So, I guess maybe one more question for you on the, as far as a resource, we've talked a lot here. Do you have do you know of any online resources out there? Would you recommend that people can kind of get up to speed on, just steelhead fishing in general?
I would look at personally what I've always relied on for steelhead fishing. Just generally is looking at some of the better names in the business, like you mentioned, Simon, Deck Hogan, going back to some of the old stuff, Trey Coombs and people like that. Yeah. The guys that cut their teeth in the early days of fly fishing for steelhead. And the thing I like to put across is just because the information is 40 years old doesn't mean it's not current and useful. I mean, there's still the same fish. And if that method and that fly caught fish 30, 40 years ago, it'll catch fish today.
For sure.
And so I tend to run everything from really current stuff all the way back, through the early days of steelhead fishing out west.
Yeah.
And look at all those old names as well as the current guys as well.
Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Then I've had Trey on the show, and it's funny, that question I like to ask just because it kind of helps people. But really, that's what I'm trying to build here is just, an online resource. And I think, what you've provided today is, is going to help a lot of people that listen to this one. So I appreciate that. So what do you have going the next 6 months or so? Do you have anything you want to talk about as far as anything new or anything upcoming for you or your the companies you're working with?
Well, I think from a company perspective, one of the most interesting developments from Loomis has been the new IMX Pro rods. Everybody talks about rods being lighter, faster, stronger, blah, 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 blah. I like to talk about what it does for us as fishermen. What does this rod do that's because there's always marginal increases. We're not talking dramatic changes. The thing I found about the new IMX that I've been fishing is they're so easy to cast well. And they're light and they work very well. A lot of light rods out there, but they're low effort, but they make your job of casting well easier. And I'm not sure what Steve Rajev magic he worked on those blanks to make it do that. But the very first time I cast one, it threw this lovely loop, and I went, "Oh, I didn't do anything; it just went." and this has been consistent. I've got 6 of them, and they're all the same. They all throw a lovely line without really having to really pay close attention. They're very, very easy casting rods. So, they're a mid-range price point. So they'd be very good for somebody who is, average fly fishing experience. And I think people, when they fish them, they'll find that, they can cast them quite easily. They do cast well. They are not fussy rods. You can put broad range of lines on them. They don't seem to care. I've got a video of me out with the 11-foot, 11-inch 7-weight spay, and I was using airflow rage heads on them. I ran everything from a 390 all the way up to a 480, and it didn't matter. Yeah. So, I mean, in the spay business, line choice can be really irritating. You can, have a hard time matching lines to rods. These rods don't care. Anything that's close, it's going to work.
Cool. Yeah.
So I think from a product standpoint, it's that. I think those IMX rods, IMX Pro rods, will make a difference for people.
Okay.
And they're not super expensive either.
Okay. And and I guess you've got some shows you'll be at that people can find you, and they can probably find a list of that. Where would be a good place where they can, if somebody wanted to get in touch with you, if they had questions about anything we talked about today?
Well, if they're going to do the shows, I'm going to be at the Spring Fishing and Boat Show starting tomorrow, and then I'll be at the Toronto Sportsman Show. I also usually run a spring spay tune-up session through the First Cast Fly Shop in Guelph. And what we do is we just get people out in the Speed River, and it's open to both beginners and people who just want to, get the winter rust off their casting shoulders. And I spend a lot of time on matching the tackle up to what they want to do, because a lot of guys come in with tackle that's not working together that well. So we go through that whole process of not just casting, but also making sure everything matches up, and it's making the job easier for them.
Okay, good. And hookedforlife.ca is the best place. That's with the 4 is the number 4. That's the best place they can get in touch with you.
That's the easiest place to get in touch with me. I've got all the contact information is there, phone numbers, everything else. And just drop me an email at info@hookedforlife.ca, and it'll get to me. And I answer all sorts of questions. It's I also respond to my YouTube comments. Facebook, I'm on Facebook as well. I have a Hooked for Life page on Facebook.
Okay.
So people have, they can ask questions, talk to me through any of those mediums, and it works fine.
Good deal. Well, I'll provide links to all those resources. And Peter, I just wanted to thank you for coming on. You've provided a bunch of great resources, and I think your perspective on things and getting people to think a little bit differently, I think, is one thing that was really great about this show today. So thanks for coming on, and hope to see you soon.
Okay, great. I enjoyed being on the show. Thanks for inviting me.
Okay, see ya.
Okay, right. Bye-bye.
So there you go. If you want to find all the show notes with all the links we covered, just go to wetflyswing.com/Peter Charles. If you like the tips in this episode, go to wetflyswing.com/free and get the Steelhead Tips PDF Quick Guide, which includes a summary of all the best tips from all the episodes so far. If you get a chance, please share this episode with at least one person so we can help that person get into maybe their first steelhead. Thanks again for stopping by to check out the show today. I'm looking forward to hopefully catching up with you soon and maybe even seeing you on the river.
Thanks for listening to the Wet Fly Swing Fly Fishing Show. For notes and links from this episode, visit wetflyswing.com. And if you found this episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review on iTunes.